So I'd like to invite you to take a minute to open up your chat box. You'll find that at the bottom of your screen, and let us know what city and state you're joining from and something for which you feel grateful today. So you should find your chat box at the bottom of your screen, and you can write to everyone and just share where you're joining from and something you're grateful for. Alicia is grateful for warm coffee. Hello, hi Bill. Grateful for Zoom, keeping us connected. Janice from Missouri is here. Oh, they're going by so quickly now. Oh, hi Mom and Dad, glad you're here. Sabrina, hi, welcome. Ash, hello, Whitney, Becky, Elizabeth, Morris, Kim, Ilan. So glad you've joined us today. Hi, Sherry. Very, very glad you're here. Morris, Casey, Kimberly. So glad you're here. And if I didn't say your name, it's because they all popped up so quickly. But to all of you, thank you so much for being here today. It's really, really a joy to be in conversation with you all. So I want to start by talking a little bit. First, I want to just give you an overview of what we're talking about today. We're talking about assumptions related to COVID-19 and climate change. We'll be talking about grief and what it is, the stages of grief. There's a framework on stages of grief developed by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and David Kessler, and we'll be talking about that. We'll be talking about making meaning in the midst of grief and making amends. And then we'll have some discussion time and share some resources. So that's our agenda for today. I want to start first with some assumptions. In this session, in this meeting, I am working under the assumption that COVID-19 is a real virus, that it is sickening and killing people around the world, and it is overwhelming health systems around the world. I'm also working under the assumption that climate change is real, and it's a normal response of our Earth's climate to an increase in carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in the Earth's atmosphere. I know that these assumptions are not everyone's assumptions about these two matters, and if they aren't yours, I would be happy to engage with you on them in another setting. But for this session, I'm going to be presenting with these assumptions in mind. Some other assumptions I have about both COVID-19 and climate change is that they are global. These are both global crises that we are facing. They are both concerns that are beyond the human scale. It's really hard to wrap our heads around the size and scale and implications of these two crises, and that's part of what makes engaging them so challenging. They both threaten privilege. There are so many situations in which people with greater privilege, economic privilege, social status, political status, where they live, where they're from, immigration status, so many different privileges that people carry that protect them from vulnerability. And these two issues threaten that privilege, and they also expose all the more deeply people with much less privilege and the vulnerabilities they experience when parts of our society and our infrastructure crumble and crack even more than they are already crumbled. And I'm also assuming that people experience these matters, COVID-19 and climate change, in different ways, depending on where they sit in relationship to the problem. So even though we are all here together concerned about these two issues, we might be bringing very different experiences and expectations and assumptions to these issues. And so as we reflect together, it's really important to stay curious, to not necessarily, even as we assume certain things, we also need to assume that our experience, our losses, our fears are different than those of others, and be curious about where other people are coming from and why. So I want to talk a little bit about grief. First thing I want to say is that grief is a normal human response to losing something you love. while conversations about grief often focus on the death of a loved one, we can grieve any type of loss, anything that we care about that we lose. We will have an experience of grief. It's thoughts, it's emotions, it's behaviors, it's physiological changes that fill our body to where we have a mind-body connection with what we're feeling about a loss, and that's normal. Grief is also biblical. We have stories upon stories of experiences of grief in the Bible. I'm sharing one scripture from Job. Job is a story in which a man loses everything he loves and everything he has. His infrastructure crumbles, his health crumbles, his social connections crumble. And he is sighing and groaning and crying out to God for help, for relief from his suffering. I wonder if you all might take a moment in the chat box to name some stories from the Bible or parts of the Bible that talk about grief, that tell stories of grief or offer laments of grief. Let's look and see what we can see in the Bible about grief. Andrew, Jesus weeping over Jerusalem. Yes, Jesus grieved. The book of Lamentations is a book of lamenting grief and suffering. Thank you, Morris. Janice reminds us that David grieves several times. Mel Caraway, the women grieving for Jesus. Yes, yes. Jesus wept. Thank you, Sherry. So yes, David grieves over his son. Thank you, Carrie. We know that that grief is a part of who we are, and we have so many models of expressing grief. And we can lean on those when we find ourselves grieving and wondering, is this normal? Am I normal? What's happening to me? Know that you are not alone, that God has given us these stories to help carry us through. Lee, yes, Bathsheba grieving the loss of her husband and her child. Laura grieving over the loss of firstborns during Moses' time and Jesus' time. Morris reminding us that John of Patmos grieves as he is socially distanced, yes, from his congregation in Asia Minor. What a good connection. Thank you. Grief is also uncomfortable sometimes, and that's part of what makes it challenging. I share this quote that you all have probably heard before from the Reverend Fred Rogers. Anything that's human is mentionable, and anything that's mentionable can become more manageable. And grief is like that. It can be hard to talk about our grief. I don't know about you, but every time I get on a call, people say, "How are you doing?" And I'm like, "I'm fine." And I'm not fine right now. This is a really hard time, and yet it's really hard to open that door about how we are doing in this moment when we are all struggling and all trying our best to be fine. Grief is also different for everyone. It depends so much on where you are in relationship to the loss. And now what I want to do is take a moment to share a little bit through a poll, and you can respond or not, it's up to you, but inviting you to reflect on what losses you have experienced in relationship to grief and to COVID-19. So Zaire, could you please share the first poll? And so have you experienced any of these losses? And you can choose as many as you like. Many of us have voted. I'll leave this open for another minute in case anyone wants to vote, but let's just look at these outcomes together. So nearly half of us used to be able to know what to expect from the weather, but now we aren't sure. A couple of us have lost a crop due to a difficult growing season. You've had an important gathering canceled due to a severe weather event. Wow, more than half of us have had an important gathering or event canceled due to a severe weather event. A third of us have had property damaged or lost due to severe weather. There are a couple of us who've lost a friend or colleague or loved one due to a severe weather event. Many of us have witnessed the damage or loss of an ecosystem that was important to us. A couple of us have not experienced any of these losses yet. I think that this is good information as we engage in conversations about climate and think about grief and wonder how climate change is impacting the person we're talking with in different ways from ourselves and from anyone else you've met. Because my guess is many of us, I bet many of us's answers are different, that each of us might have had a different set of results on this survey. So thank you for answering this poll. Let's end this poll. And now we have a second poll about your experiences of loss in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic. You should now see the poll of losses you have experienced in the last month. And know that your answers are anonymous. We don't know who is saying what. So I see that many participants have had a gathering or event that was important to them canceled. I have too, and it's a big deal. It's a real loss. Almost a third of us have had a friend or colleague or loved one pass away. 97% of us no longer are able to see the people we regularly see. 16% of us have lost or had their employment situation change. A couple of people are experiencing faltering health in this time, and one person hasn't experienced any losses related to the pandemic. You know, I really honor all of the losses we are experiencing in relation to this pandemic, and I think it's really important to name them as grief, because it does become more manageable when we can name our reactions to these losses as grief responses. It can begin to help us put some structure around what's happening in this thing that feels so big and amorphous and outside of ourselves and outside of our control. Thank you for sharing. We can close the poll now. So I want to move now to talking a little bit, and I'm closing my chat, but feel free to keep sharing your comments with one another. I just can't see my screen when the chat's up. Sharing about the stages of grief developed by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and David Kessler. The first stage is denial. Denial is something that helps us cope. It allows us to pace our feelings of grief, and it allows feelings that were denied to surface as we learn about a situation. And I think that our automatic response to denial or encountering someone who we perceive to be in denial is a negative response. If we think we see something clearly and the person we're encountering does not, we sort of poo-poo that. We say, oh, that person's in denial. They're not facing what's happening. And it's helpful to remember that denial isn't just sort of choice-based ignorance is a coping mechanism. It's something that comes from within as much as it comes from something that we choose. And so it's important to realize that. Now, when we're thinking both about COVID and climate change, here are some ways that I've seen people express their denial. They say this isn't really happening. You know, we're hearing experts say this, but it's not true. This is fake news. People say this isn't as big a deal as the doctors or the scientists say it would be. Have you all heard anything like this in the last little while? You can nod. Yeah, I have too. And you know, I have felt that too. I mean, both with climate and with COVID, I've had moments of thinking, is this really that big a deal? Or what news do I trust? And with climate, same thing. I've had moments of thinking like this can't be happening because it is so different from the reality I am experiencing. The next stage of grief is anger. Anger gives structure and expression to this chasm of loss that we feel when the bottom drops out from our understanding of relationship and reality. And it's a pathway. It's a pathway for expressing pain. You know, some of the things that people say in relation to anger, they say, don't tell me how to live my life. Don't tell me I have to shelter in place. Don't tell me I shouldn't fly multiple times a year. Or they say this is the fault of people who live in other countries, or the fault of people who are less educated than I am, or the fault of people who don't care about anybody but themselves. It's very easy and normal to say, this isn't about me, it's about them. And then there's the anger that says, why isn't anyone doing anything about this? How can this really be happening and appropriate action is not being taken? This is a normal response to what's happening both with climate and with COVID. And it's a grief response that our minds and spirits give us as we're trying to process what's happening. Bargaining. This is an attempt to create a different outcome than what we're experiencing. It's a result of owning, or it can be a result of owning or blaming oneself for a loss, and it can be an attempt to avoid feeling the pain of a loss. Bargaining looks like this. It looks like saying, if we all take a few simple steps, everything will be fine and things won't change at a deeper level. Or if we just wait for the scientists to come up with a fix, everything will be fine and nothing will change. And I think that's the hardest, oh, I have a stray apostrophe, sorry about that. I think that's the hardest thing about this is this sense that we both know there are things we need to do in both situations, and we know there's a deep need for systemic change. Even if we do what we need to do, and there is systemic change, there has still been deep loss that can't be recovered, and there is still damage that will continue into the future. And that's really hard to cope with. And so naturally, this can lead to a sense of helplessness or depression, a sense of fog, a sense of powerlessness, sadness, withdrawing from activities and relationships. My colleague Alicia, who's here, talks about COVID brain. Whenever I make a mistake, she says, it's okay, it's just COVID brain. And I think that many of us are experiencing that sense of powerlessness and fog right now. This can be expressed as I can't read the news, it's overwhelming. There's nothing I can do. I feel like I'm underwater if I think about this, and I'm totally powerless in this situation. The last stage, well, not the last stage, the fifth stage is acceptance. Acceptance is a desire to attempt in a world in which the loss has occurred, and a recognition that the past is no longer intact and we need to readjust. Acceptance says this is real and it's happening now. Systemic change is required to keep the worst from happening, and we need to take action now. So acceptance isn't about saying that, well, climate change is happening and nothing can be done, so the world is going to burn. It's about understanding that climate change is real and it's happening now, and systemic change is required to keep the worst from happening. And similarly with COVID, accepting that we are in a situation of pandemic, and it doesn't mean that we have to stay in this place, but that we're going to have to take action to move away from this place into a new one. There is a 6th stage of grief developed by David Kessler, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's colleague, that he recently developed and wrote a book about called Finding Meaning. He says that meaning making is relative and it's personal. Only you can find your own meaning in your grief, and it takes time to find. And even when you find it, it won't feel like it's worth the cost of what you lost. It's not that meaning is something you get to have and it's a win. It's more of a part of the process that can help soothe a loss in the long term. And I think when we think about the situations we're facing, we need to be asking and can find meaning in wondering, who is God calling us to be right now? What is God calling us as a faith community to do right now? And what is my role in this larger story? David Kessler also talks about making amends with one another and with a situation to find healing and hope. And I'm still trying to figure out what making amends might mean in these global crises. Is it about forgiving our leaders and moving on? Is it about forgiving myself for the ways I have failed to live as I know I should and the ways I've contributed to the problem at hand? And is it about maybe creating intentions for living in new ways to carry forward, a sort of a repentance that carries us into the future? So this is something I'm still wrestling with, and I invite you to wrestle with it as well. So now we're going to move into breakout groups. On Zoom, we're able to put you all into smaller groups, and we'll be sharing these discussion questions within the group, and you'll have about 15 minutes to introduce yourselves to one another and to reflect together if you wish. And we will not be recording the breakout group sessions. So please go ahead, Alicia, and move us into groups.
Climate and COVID in terms of the responses that we're having. And how we address COVID brings a lot of lessons to bear for us in how we address climate. And
I guess my sense is time is moving along very quickly and we're losing a huge part of our life and chance to be with our family and our friends.
Yeah.
And I guess that's grief.
Yeah, absolutely. I see we have some folks who've shared as well. Oh, some of the Andrew shared appreciation for the strategy someone offered for overcoming the objection that by drawing together climate change and the pandemic, one is politicizing. Jim shared that he heard about direct climate impacts, COVID and climate-induced hunger, and personal pain, grief, and loss from both of them. Thank you. Casey shared, it seems like we cycle or spiral between these stages. That is so true. I feel like I feel all these stages in one day most days if I'm awake and present to how I feel. We absolutely do. I don't think there's a beginning and end to this. Marcia shared that we lost some valuable church members during this season, and it's been difficult to accept not being able to celebrate their life together as a church. I'm so sorry for your loss. Carrie shared that several members of the group are grieving scarcity of food due to both climate change and hoarding. Yes, and these two things bring each other out, the scarcity that is brought about by climate change and disruptions in supply chains, and the hoarding that comes out when people are afraid that there isn't enough and feel they need to take more even at the expense of others. Alon shared that fear and anxiety of dealing with climate change, evacuations, and then the forced separation of COVID. What an interesting intersection. And that is so real. The separations from our homes and the separations from important places and one another, they overlap and intersect. Whitney says it was wonderful to hear that most everyone, even if frustrated or angry, has found some sort of silver lining, whether more time with family or seeing parts of the planet heal. Well, and perhaps that's some of the meaning making that we can experience as we live through these strange and changing times. What meaning can we find in the unexpected bright sides of our disruptions? Morris talks about praying out our anger, giving those feelings of pain and frustration to God, and making space for new growth when feelings are released. Lynette shares that grief is compounded not just by climate and COVID, but also other stresses in our lives. This past year has been deeply challenging with her family's health. And just when she started to take a breath and have some relief, another thing to bear. And that is so hard when these global challenges stack up on top of the normal day-to-day challenges we experience. Becky's noting the distance from others so painful to our healing and ability to cope. And nature is the only safe place to be together, 6 feet apart. For those of you on the Creation Care Network, I shared an article about hugging trees and how the Icelandic Forest Service is recommending people hug trees to have a sense of connection with a living thing. Really a beautiful article. And Alon noted that we need to give ourselves great grace and permission to feel these stages of grief, which may all occur in one day. We need to be kind to ourselves. Ash is building on Mel's point, making meaning by applying the lessons from the COVID situation to the climate crisis. How both crises that hit vulnerable people hard, and we need to if we can come together for COVID, maybe we can for climate as well. Andrew notes, many of these reflections could lead to letters to the editors of newspapers promoting environmental responsibility, something we can do in light of this. This is all good stuff, you all. I appreciate your conversation. I appreciate your participation. I'm gonna share my screen now. As we start to move toward the end, I'll be sharing these readings with you. We'll send an email follow-up after the webinar, sending you a link to the webinar, and we'll send this list of readings as well. And we'll put them on the Creation Care Network platform as well. But these are all resources I used as I was contemplating this webinar, and there's so much more there beyond what we were able to discuss today. So I hope that if you're looking for something to read that will help you process your experiences, you'll check out some of these books. I also would like to commend to you the Creation Care Network. Everyone who is not on the network who indicated interest when they signed up for the webinar received an invitation this morning. So do check it out because it's a place for additional connection. One last question I have for you in the chat. I feel like we've talked a little about how the commonalities and the ways we respond to COVID and climate might inform each other. And I also want to know, what's something you heard today that you want to remember as you leave this webinar? Can you share in the chat something you heard today that you want to remember? Oh, Charlie shared he has an enhanced appreciation of his privilege based on density data of less privileged communities. Yeah. Something you want to remember as you prepare to leave today. Michael's wanting to remember to connect to people where they are. Alon wants to give permission to herself and kids to grieve over losses. Ash wants to remember about making meaning. It doesn't mean that it was worth the loss. Bill says when talking with others, allow the space for stages of grief. Maura says it's nice to know we're not in this alone. No, we are not. Emily, we don't have to jump to meaning making before we're ready. Charlie, Give grace. Be a good listener. Sherry, not so much the one thing, but the collective faces of everyone here gives her hope. Me too. Kim, I like the idea of a 6th level to grief, finding meaning. This may help us in lessons learned from COVID or be adaptive for solutions to climate. Yeah. The side-by-side similarities of processing climate and COVID grief. Yes, Jim. Carrie, giving ourselves extra grace in this difficult time. Morris's remark that when he shares emotions, others can feel enabled to share. To those with children, cherishing the moment, staying positive and connected, and then back to jumping and getting back to work. Second on the 6th level. Thank you. Thank you for sharing these thoughts and reflections. I'm so grateful to have had this hour with you. And now I want to share a blessing. Please just take a breath, find your feet on the ground. Let there be an opening into the quiet. What lies beneath the chaos, where you find the peace you did not think possible, and see what shimmers within the storm. Amen. Blessings to you all. And I know some of you were very excited to see familiar faces here. We'll leave this room open for about 15 minutes. So if some of you want to chat and connect with one another, you are welcome to do so. Otherwise, goodbye and blessings, and we'll hopefully meet again. Take care.